fire safety at the home. Move on to the next slide. So that is, focusing on, smoke alarms, smoke detectors, making sure that you have them on every floor of the house, making sure that the batteries are checked and changed, right? You should be doing that at least twice a year, paying attention to that, right? And obviously you want something close to the sleeping areas at the very least from there. Another thing, right? I have kids in my house, and we talked about, right, how we get out of the house, right, in case of a fire. Fire in my house is probably my biggest fear. But fire in my house with my kids, my family in it is something that I worry about. And we have talked about, right, how to get out of the house, the exit routes, what the escape plan is, and the potential for fires to kick up in various different places of the house overall. So that's something that, right, whether it's kids, right, or just, other grown-ups or spouses or other people who live in your house, I think it's good to all be on the same page in case something happens. The other aspect is you should get out and stay out, right? You shouldn't come back in your house thinking you're going to save, pets or pictures or other things that you think are valuable overall. The most valuable thing is your life and the life of your family, right? So making sure everybody gets out of the house and nobody re-enters it. Call for help, right? Call the fire department, let them do their job, right? And don't be doing things to put yourself in danger or put them in a compromising position as they show up and starting to do what they were brought in to do and trained to do. And then keeping fire extinguishers in the home is incredibly important, right? Little fires can pop up right while you're cooking and doing different things. So having that fire extinguisher in the house and having it accessible, also incredibly important overall. So, and just remember that having a fire extinguisher is not a substitute for having an escape plan, right? So, just, don't think you're invincible just because you have a fire extinguisher and know how to use it. That's our safety message. Moving into the normal disclaimer overall, everybody should have noticed that the recording has started, right? So just be aware of that. And then this is the normal disclaimer that we have on all of our presentations, right? Just around the information being prepared for this meeting specifically. It is obviously factual at this time, but things are always subject to change over time. And just to make sure people are aware of that, and nothing here obviously should be taken or changed for any different purposes. And then the last thing I'll touch on, right, is the force majeure, right? We all know what happened last March of 2020. At the end of March 2020, we declared a force majeure around COVID and the issues that we were seeing then. We've been lucky enough as a company to go back to close to blue sky, right? Which means that, we do have people working. We're trying to, do everything the way we had done it before, obviously with additional restrictions, safety restrictions. Things might take a little bit longer. But we are pretty close to blue sky. The one thing that we're running into are supply chain issues. So what we have done in the recent past is issue specific force majeure letters out to projects that are experiencing supply chain issues, right? There's certain equipment that our normal suppliers have been unable to get, right? Which have obviously slowed in their ability to provide us with the equipment that we're used to having, on hand or being able to get quicker, right? And I think we're all experiencing that in our everyday lives too, right? That the supply chain issues are pretty broad. So just keep that in mind, right? We're doing everything we can to mitigate that, right? Having conversations, trying to be proactive, but there are situations in certain equipment that that do have long lead times, and we will be reaching out, having conversations about those, and issuing force majeure notifications about those pieces of equipment and those supply chain and lead times. I think that's it. So we will jump into our first topic, which is around FERC feeders, and Jamie Tobin will take that over.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Can you hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, great. Hello, everybody. My name is Jamie, and I will be presenting the topic on FERC feeders. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide here just gives a basic overview of what a FERC distribution feeder is. Feeder is considered FERC once a wholesale power sale occurs over the feeder. So in other words, if a customer chooses to participate in the wholesale market and their system is interconnected, that feeder is now a FERC feeder. Once a feeder is considered FERC, it will always be FERC. So that means if the customer that triggered the FERC feeder for some reason discontinues operation, or the generator moves to a new feeder, that original feeder will still be FERC. Just want to mention that. Next slide, please. Thank you. These next couple of slides will go over how a FERC feeder can affect your project individually. The first thing I want to mention is the importance of identifying early in the interconnection process if you do plan to participate in the wholesale markets, because this could change the way your project is managed, as well as the timeline. The two options for markets would be the federal or state route. So the first I want to go over is the federal, which is wholesale market participation. If you do decide to participate in the wholesale market and the generating facility is proposed to interconnect to an already existing FERC feeder, you will need to interconnect through the ISO Schedule 23 process. The link for more information on ISO's process is provided below, and these slides will be shared after this presentation, just an FYI, so all the links included will be provided. There is one exception. The ISO route can be avoided if your generator is the first to interconnect to a distribution feeder that intends to engage in the wholesale market. So once that generator connects, the feeder becomes FERC. Now moving forward, any other projects participating in the wholesale market must follow the ISO Schedule 23 interconnection process. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other market choice would be the retail market, which is the state route. So if your generator plans to participate in the state market and not the wholesale market, it is also proposed to interconnect to an already existing FERC feeder, your project can continue through the state process and does not have to go through ISO's Schedule 23 process. On our homepage, we keep an updated list of active and pending FERC feeders. So I provided the link here as well. This list is updated annually, and if you do see a feeder that is a pending FERC feeder, that means that the trigger project has yet to interconnect. So this is subject to change. It may not be an official FERC feeder. All just depends on if that project interconnects. Great. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is the last slide for this section. It's just a screenshot of what our website provides to show pending and active FERC feeders, like I just mentioned. The link will bring you to our homepage, and if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see exactly what I have here. All that you would need to do is enter the feeder you're inquiring about in the search bar highlighted in the screenshot. And then if your feeder does not appear, that means that it is not active or pending. And so if you don't see it, that just means that it's not there. We're working on updating this, so now you can search any feeder. So coming soon, you'll be able to see a no there as well for the registered with FERC column. And that is all I have for this topic. So thank you very much for listening. The next topic we'll be going over asset registration, and Joe Vudo will be presenting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. As mentioned, I'll be going over asset registration. So there's two different types of asset registration, and if we can go to the next slide. All right, so there are settlement only generators and model only generators. So settlement only generators, or SOG, are facilities with a max export less than 5 megawatts, interconnection voltage less than 115 kV, that settle for energy or capacity only and are not visible or controllable by ISO's control rooms and don't make bids into e-market. So that's the more common process most customers that have connected projects already are probably familiar with. The process that we're primarily focusing on today, model generators, or MOGs, are one or more facilities at a single location that's fully visible and controllable by ISO's control room, that bid into the day ahead and or real-time energy markets, contribute to price information, and dispatch based on price. So one of the most important things about these processes and what I'm going to be talking about today is this link listed at the bottom here. So definitely want to emphasize the importance of customers saving this link. It'll be available on the slides when they're sent out, and going to this location to familiarize yourself with more details. There's more than just these definitions there. It'll help customers identify which process or which of these their projects will fall onto. So definitely strongly encourage customers to familiarize themselves with those details, and definitely save the link and make sure to visit it so you feel comfortable and understand what's applicable for your project. Next slide, please. So some people may have noticed already, but there's a question that's been added to the application for new projects coming in that asks, do you plan to register your asset as a model generator? It's important to understand at the beginning of projects if a project's going to be an SOG or MOG, because this can impact studies, as in whether studies are required or how studies are conducted. So we're pushing to try and understand at the beginning of the process whether it's going to be SOG or MOG. And also later on in the process, it's still important as well for project closeout steps that'll impact those two. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the SOG process is one people are probably mostly familiar with already, but I can go through it quickly here. So for projects that aren't bidding into ISO markets and are not visible or controllable by ISO's control rooms, for those cases, once a witness test is approved, if applicable, compliance docs are submitted and approved, meters installed and communicating and all those steps. National Grid will then register the project with ISO on the customer's behalf. So the National Grid will register the asset. And then the authority to interconnect will be issued on the effective date from that registration process. And that will be the start date of when a project will begin to be paid for the export, and projects that are registered as qualifying facilities will receive the separate QF payments that are based on the average hourly clearing price as reported by ISO. Next slide, please. So MOG is the main focus here. It is the developer's responsibility to begin the MOG registration process, and they can do that by contacting ISO through the email address listed here. It's recommended that ISO be contacted early in the interconnection process, as the process has been known to take very long time. So we've seen it take a year or longer. So we want customers to take that into account and initiate the process early on with those timeframes in mind. For MOG projects MOG projects will require remote terminal units for communication as part of this process. So customers should be reaching out to their job owners regarding the RTU process as soon as they're at a stage that they're ready. And somewhat similar, but some slight differences for MOG projects as compared to SOG. Once witness tests, compliance documents, and RTU requirements are met, the meter will be installed, communication confirmed, and then following that communication, National Grid will sign off on the registration as the asset owner, host participant, and meter reader, and will submit it back to the customer, who will then submit to ISO for the asset registration. So a distinction here. For SOG projects, National Grid will register the asset on the customer's behalf. For modeled projects, the customer will be registering the asset direct with ISO. Next slide, please. So for MOG projects similar to SOG, the authority to interconnect will be issued on the effective date for the project. And that'll be when the payments can start from. But there are instances, so if a customer, for instance, is looking for just a battery to participate in the MOG process, not solar, for example, the system may interconnect prior to the MOG process being completed for that battery by registering the system through the SOG process for that PV in that system in parallel with progressing the MOG process for that battery. So that was it for the slides that I'm going through for the MOG process, or just a quick highlight or emphasis on I think the key takeaway. Just want to remind customers of that link on the first slide. Definitely make sure to go to that link, familiarize yourselves with processes, the details on there, and get to a stage that you feel comfortable identifying if your project falls under the SOG or MOG category. And if it is an MOG, make sure to initiate that process early on. And that is all I have for today. Thank you. So now I'll move to Jen. Take it away, Jen.
Good morning, everybody. I'll be talking about ASO studies. Next slide, James. Next slide. Thanks. So what is an ASO? An affected system operator refers to any entity that has responsibility of operating or operational control of affected systems, whether they be transmission or distribution. There's some examples there, but you can take a peek at those. What is an ASO study? An ASO study is a study required by an affected system operator and any of the affected system operators mentioned above. This is a study required to identify impacts of proposed DG on any affected transmission system and or the electric power system of neighboring companies. Most commonly, we see transmission ASO studies. Transmission ASO studies will likely be either what we refer to as non-comprehensive or comprehensive. The identification of which study path your project will take is determined by the affected system operator. The most prevalent differences between non-comprehensive and comprehensive ASO studies is really the study elements within the study. Non-comprehensive is essentially a pared down transmission study, whereas our comprehensive studies are a full transmission study with all components required. Next slide, please. Why are ASO studies becoming more prominent, specifically transmission studies? Real simple answer, folks, it's due to the level of saturation. ISO has some predetermined thresholds for transmission study requirements. And unfortunately, as we are nearing those thresholds, or as we cross those thresholds, we're seeing more and more studies being required by ISO before they will approve an application to move to the RC, through the RC approval process. What are the reasons for varied cost of ASO studies? Costs are based off the scale of the transmission study. You could have a transmission study that encompasses multiple applications. That doesn't necessarily mean the study will cost more. So we would be able to share the cost of that transmission study endeavor, most likely pro rata across all applications. Whereas, you know, if you're requiring a full comprehensive study and you're the only application that is being studied, unfortunately, you would bear the total cost for that study. Similarly, non-comprehensive study doesn't require as much effort, and usually only impacts one or two applications, and it most often occurs when the totality of DER is under 5 megawatts. So obviously the cost is going to be a little more palatable for something like that. Next slide. How long does an ASO study take? Most frequently, we're seeing non-comprehensive studies come in within a 4 to 6 month time frame. Comprehensive studies, the expected timeline is 6 to 12 months. It's important to note that this timeline doesn't actually start until the study is paid and all required documentation is received. So we are seeing requirements for modeling in the comprehensive study space. So if you are required to, if your application is required to go through a comprehensive study required by ISO New England or NEP for any other reason, you will be expected to submit a model for that study in advance of the study start. When will I know if an ASO study is required for my project? So current business practice is to present your project to ISO New England for RC approval at the 20 business day review in the distribution impact study. The reason we do that at that point is that the distribution engineers will identify high-level impacts that could be a decision point in the life cycle of your project. So in other words, if there are substantial upgrades that you could mitigate by reducing the size of your project, you would make that decision at this point in the distribution impact study. Those types of criteria are very relevant to what we present to ISO for the RC, and very relevant to whether or not your project at its size tips a threshold that would potentially require an ASO study. So we do want to make sure that you have a settled system size and design before we present your project to ISO New England, specifically to the RC agenda for approval. Next slide, please. And a very common question we get at the 20 business day is, can my distribution study proceed in parallel to an ASO study? And the answer is no. We don't offer it because if your project goes through an ASO study and there are transmission impacts identified, there's an opportunity throughout the pendency of the distribution impact study to mitigate some of those identified impacts or concerns. So we don't want to absorb all of your engineering dollars in the engineering effort on the distribution side. Should we have to address something like this? Because on the other end, it would ultimately cost more and it would take more time. So we hold the project at the impact study at 20 business days until we get approval from ISO engineers at the conclusion of an ASO study to move your application formally to the RC agenda. You know, of course, once your application falls on an RC agenda, there's always the potential for the application and or study analysis to be questioned before you receive formal approval. However, at the 1 to 5 megawatt range, it's unlikely. So we would allow the distribution study to proceed once we get ISO approval to move your project to the RC agenda. Unfortunately, we will not deliver a distribution impact study until we receive formal approval from the RC for your project. And that's for obvious reasons. And I think that's all I had regarding ASO. I think I'm handing it off to Mike for some IEEE notifications. James, next slide. All yours, Mike.
Thank you, Jen. So yeah, I'm just going to go through a quick update on some changes to inverter requirements based on IEEE standards and updates there. So Specifically, the document you want to look at is linked on the top of the slide here. So it's an ISO document relative to requirements for the bulk power system, but it will define how we're going to be interconnecting some inverters on the distribution side. So that document supersedes the ISO standards from 2018, and it has some updates that are aligning with the latest version of the IEEE 1547 requirement. And the update of that document did have a good deal of industry involvement and cross-coordination and collaboration. So it wasn't just made in a vacuum, but you can read through it for details more, but we have kind of the summary here. So from 1547, what that document is really doing, it's updating certain elements of the inverter capabilities. So the biggest ones to note that were the main points of interest and why this update happened were relative to the ride-through requirements, trip settings, and certain grid support functionality that is within the inverters themselves. So again, those details are in the link above, but really all the functionality that is of concern, it'll be encompassed in the new UL 1741 SB inverters, which are expected to be commercially available around the spring of 2022. And the timing here was kind of aligned with some industry and commercial representation that said that's when they could have those products available for the market. So the SB settings, the SB type inverter, whereas right now we're requiring the SA, UL 1741 SA. This would be a new type of inverter that'll be available and be required. So what does it really mean for connecting to a national grid system? So we're going to be looking at any applications that are deemed complete after April 1st of next year. Those are all going to be required to have the SB type inverters. Now, the only exception there is if it's a smaller project, 100 kW or less. Those are going to be, we're going to look to have that in June of next year. And again, those dates are all meant to align with the commercial availability of the products. We wanted to communicate this out now so that everyone has kind of clear expectations going forward of what we'll be looking for. But obviously, if something happens in the market and these products are not commercially available, we may need to revisit it at a later date. But this is what we are looking at right now and planning forward for what we know at this time. So that's this is just a one slide update. So I think that's all I have right now on the 1547.
All right, thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody. So we only have a couple of questions that have come in, so maybe we'll give it a minute here. I'll talk a little slow, see if there are any other questions that are going to come in over these last couple of topics. Right, the one thing I will mention, right, is we have seen a few questions come in that are a little bit off topic for this agenda. So we'll see, if there's any time, but we will get back to those or get answers to those questions. Be able to provide that either directly back to the person who asked, or if it makes sense, put it in the Q&A document. So I'm going to take sort of the first one. I think we got a few popping up here. So the first question is around FERC markets. And so the question is, does any ISO New England market revenue expectation require filing under the FERC process? For example, if the facility wants to participate in the passive demand response market, does that require a FERC process for interconnection? So I'll take a first pass at this. Anybody else who wants to join in from National Grid, please do. But I think the simple answer is no. A demand response transaction, it doesn't trigger the FERC jurisdiction, right, of a distribution feeder. So an actual power sale needs to occur, not a reduction in the load. So like I said, simple answer is no. Overall, right, it is ultimately up to the applicant, right, who, how you plan to, utilize your project, right, it's up to the applicant to identify that as early on in the process as possible and reach out to ISO to just make sure, right, that you understand what process is necessary, what interconnection process, whether it is the ISO process, whether it is the state process that you end up pushing your project down. Just, you know, to save time, obviously energy, money, all those different things. Right, it is important that you don't just rely on this presentation. Right, we do deal with ISO quite a bit. We have a good understanding of what those processes are, but at the end of the day, the ISO are the subject matter experts and should be consulted depending on how you plan on using your project overall. Going to see what else has popped in. So another question says, I missed the definition of an SB inverter. Can you please clarify that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So the an SB inverter, what we're referring to there is UL. So there's UL certification of all inverters. UL 1741 is the testing standard for all inverters, and they've had supplements to that testing criteria over the years. So supplement A is what we're looking at right now. So when you submit a UL 1741 SA inverter, it's under that kind of what was the most up-to-date testing criteria. SB has increased testing criteria for some of those elements that we listed on the slide for certain grid support activities, ride-through settings, and things of that nature that are just built into the inverters themselves. So it's in reference to the testing standards. So when you look for the certification of your inverter, you'll have to look for specifically, today you're looking for a UL 1741 SA. As of April next year, we will be looking for the SB certification, which is the next iteration of that testing.
Great, thank you, Mike. I think this next one is for you too, right? It says IEEE 2018. If we're maintaining or replacing an older inverter under warranty with the same inverter, the type SA, for example, will that be allowed? We're not always supplied with the new generation inverter from the manufacturer when performing service work.
Right. So I think part of the sure I'm off mute. Part of the expectation is that after the SB inverters become commercially available, really all inverter manufacturers are going to be switching over to that new testing criteria for any new units that they're going to be sending out. For any existing units that may be getting refurbished or repaired, if it is the same unit that was there before, and it's just getting a repair to it, I think in that case, we still are going to be looking at it as an equipment replacement. And for all equipment replacements, we look for that equipment and that design to be brought up to the current standards. So I think we would be looking for the SB, even if you are replacing or refurbishing an SA. And obviously there are project specifics that can come up on different jobs. We can maybe talk those through, but the general policy will be looking for the SB for all inverters, whether they're new or replacement, after that that April and June date that we showed on the slide.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So James, can you do me a favor? Can you roll back to slide 9? Jamie, that's in your section. So as you're rolling that back, I'll read this question here. But it's around slide 9, right? What is the actual change in review for interconnection? Can you show slide 9 and explain the impact on review for the small, less than 1 megawatt, if it's on a FERC jurisdictional line, and what makes it eligible for an exception?
Are you referring to the first on feeder exception?
Yes, I believe so.
So if the project is the first project to make that project FERC, it doesn't have to go through the ISO Schedule 23 process. It can continue with the state process with National Grid. Does that make sense? Like if the feeder was not already FERC and then that project comes along and is participating in wholesale market and is participating is going through our state process with National Grid, they don't need to go through the ISO Schedule 23 process because they're the first one to trigger the FERC feeder. But any project that comes after that will have, and is participating in wholesale market, will have to go through the ISO Schedule 23 process.
Yeah, this is Chris. If I could just, Chris Novak here from National Grid, if I could just jump in. Yeah, the first on a feeder exception, really, it's irregardless of the size of the facility. It really just goes to which particular interconnection process a project would need to go through depending on what they want to do with their power. And the exception just lays out that, you know, for interconnection purposes, the first project on a feeder, if it wants to engage in wholesale power sales, it can do so utilizing a state jurisdictional interconnection agreement, because the feeder at that point is not FERC jurisdictional. It remains state because a wholesale power sale has not occurred over it. As Jamie was mentioning, once that first facility engages in a wholesale power sale, then that feeder has now become FERC jurisdictional, and subsequent generators that want to interconnect to that feeder and also engage in wholesale power sales will need to go through the ISO Schedule 23 process. So it, in essence, creates a sort of window of time where a state jurisdictional IA could be sufficient and allowable for wholesale market participation. There's sort of like that short period of time. Does that answer? I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so we are seeing a few more pop up here. So just moving on to the next one. So Sean, I believe, Sean Diamond, this will be for you. It says if someone interconnects through the retail distribution interconnection process, not the FERC process, but subsequently is aggregated in a FERC 2222 aggregation, and begins to participate in the ISO New England wholesale market, what must the facility do with whom, if anything?
Hey, Will. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I do just want to preface that there is a DPU call later today specifically about FERC versus state jurisdictional questions. For FERC 2222 specifically, the FERC order does state that participation in aggregation will not trigger the first FERC jurisdictional requirements. Beyond that, as far as who to contact, at this point, I am going to just recommend that, you know, we will have to revisit this, you know, once ISO New England actually submits their requests to FERC for approval of the requirements. In general, you know, as National Grid, there will be some sort of requirement to contact us and let us know, but the mechanism and the process for doing that has not been defined yet. So we will have to wait until ISO New England, you know, makes that determination. But obviously, we would have to figure out how that impacts, you know, that participation in the aggregation, how that impacts, you know, the billing credits that are, you know, currently enrolled based on the scenario where they've already been interconnected before starting participation in an aggregation. So again, definitely a lot more to find out in the future as that FERC 2222 order progresses through ISO New England's process and FERC's process. And also just a reminder that, you know, there is that DPU call later today on this FERC versus state jurisdictional topic. So, you know, that answer might evolve in the future.
Yeah, this is just Chris. I agree with everything Sean said. Just to add a little bit more color in that, you know, it is an ongoing compliance process for ISO New England, and so the rules are a little bit in flux right now. But as Sean mentioned, what we do know for fairly certain for a particular fact scenario where you have a facility that desires to participate exclusively in a aggregation. The FERC orders on this have made clear that that facility may continue to interconnect pursuant to the state process. and the state interconnection procedures, and again, continue to be a part of that aggregation. I think the implication from that is, and then as Sean mentioned, we'll get, I think, some clarity from this from ISO New England through their compliance process, but I think the implication is that if that facility were to go outside of the aggregation and try to participate individually on its own in markets, then the default rules that we've been sort of discussing regarding interconnections and ISO New England's rules regarding market participation would kick in. But again, we're still sort of awaiting confirmation from ISO New England in the compliance process on that.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification, Chris and Sean. So the next one is, can you share any rule of thumb thresholds for projects small enough to proceed without being in the ASO studies? So one thing I just want to preface, is really around the definition of the ASO, affected system operator. Traditionally, we've seen ASO studies be transmission-related studies, but that does not mean that that is the only kind of ASO study that could ever happen. Right, so there are situations, obviously, on the fringes of national grid territory that could be impacted by municipals, other utilities, other system operators, right, of other electric power systems, could create a situation where an ASO study would be necessary and would not be specifically transmission related. Around an ASO study, as we've traditionally seen them in the transmission side, right, projects that are 1 megawatt and less would not trigger the need for an ASO study at this time by themselves. We have seen situations where other projects in queue or in some sort of area or group study, right, that there have been impacts to projects' ability to move forward, right, smaller projects' ability to move forward because of ASO studies, but those smaller projects are not specifically in that transmission study that would end up taking place. So just around what's the threshold, it's really 1 megawatt and below would not be subject to a transmission ASO study. So the next one, potentially I think is the last one we have as of right now, but it says, when will National Grid indicate if a feeder is under FERC jurisdiction on the hosting capacity maps with a monthly update of the status versus the annual update performed today? So I think we already have some of that information in the portal. I don't know if Jamie or Sean, one of you want to take that, or
yeah. Well, I can take that. So, the updates to the hosting capacity map and also the status in the portal where we have it will continue to be annual, because that's the cycle at which ISO New England adds participants to the market. So, on a monthly basis, we wouldn't have anything to update. However, we will continue as we have before to add a pending status to give folks a heads up as we become aware of this, and that would update in the portal as we become aware, and then on a monthly basis afterwards. But again, that pending status only means that we know that someone on the feeder has indicated that they're intending to participate in the wholesale market, not that the feeder itself is actually FERC jurisdictional at that point.
Okay, great, thank you, Sean. Just looking to see. So I don't see any more questions on here right now. So I'll stretch a little bit for maybe a couple of these, right, that aren't specifically on topic, but obviously someone was interested in the answer and submitted it. But the first one is, our National Grid pre-application and application costs for a proposed CHP project similar to those of solar? And the answer is yes, they're exactly the same, right? So regardless of the technology, pre-app cost is the same, the application cost is the same, right? But just keep in mind on CHPs, it's not always just about the electric side, right? That there's some potential gas infrastructure impact overall. And the pre-app itself is specific around sort of the electric sort of interconnection piece of it. So just keeping that in mind, but overall the costs are no different. Let's see, anything else pop up here? So we had a question around will projects be subjected to Schedule 23 if they're not going to participate in wholesale markets, even though they are on a FERC jurisdictional feeder? So Jamie, I think you touched on that. I don't know if you or Chris want to speak to that one.
Sure, this is Chris. I can sort of jump in. So the answer is no. If there's no intent to engage in a wholesale transaction, then ISO New England's interconnection process will not be triggered.
Thank you, Chris. So this one is directed at you, Sean. It says, does that mean that others can interconnect to a feeder under retail 9, even if someone has previously applied as a FERC jurisdiction likely participant, at least until ISO New England has provided its annual update?
Yeah, well, I think I can clarify. I think the IX is supposed to be interconnection instead of 9, Roman numeral 9. But yeah, I think just to clarify, when I was referencing that annual update, you know, that's the cycle at which we will typically, as the distribution company, be notified from ISO that there are new market participants that are making wholesale transactions. And so that's where I was indicating that, you know, on an annual basis, that's when folks should expect to see those updates, because that's when we find out about it. You know, that being said, if we are notified, you know, of things off cycle, we will update them as that information becomes available to us. So potentially those could show up on a monthly basis. But if folks are sitting around waiting month to month to double check a feeder, it typically will be on the annual cycle. And then just to kind of parse out the question there, and reiterate, it is not on application to the ISO New England, you know, through that ISO FERC jurisdictional interconnection process. It's on the wholesale market transaction for that project on the feeder happening, which would mean that the project physically would have already been interconnected, and would have started participating in whatever wholesale markets, you know, they're indicating. So, you know, up until that point, the folks following that retail interconnection process, that are not the first on the feeder, or, you know, not yet the first on the feeder, they would still be following, you know, the same processes before. You know, I guess, you know, Chris or anybody else that wants to clarify, you know, there is a lot of, you know, information that we've already talked about that, you know, if you are intending to participate in the wholesale market and you really are concerned about that first on the feeder, you know, you should be very closely coordinating both with National Grid and ISO New England. But beyond that, I'll leave it there, and just refer back to what's happened in the rest of the call.
Yeah, this is Chris. I agree with everything Sean said. You know, I think the advice is sound that, you know, if there's an intent to engage in a wholesale transaction, certainly the cleanest and easiest path would be to follow the Schedule 23 process. There have been instances, right, where we talked about the first on the feeder exception, whereby a generator could utilize a state interconnection agreement and qualify for, let's say, forward capacity market participation. that is currently allowed under ISO New England's rules, but you know, it's something that, you know, we're not quite sure if that would continue in the future. You know, so you could have a scenario where Sean was laying out where you have a generator, they've submitted an application as indicating that they intend to engage in wholesale power sales. Let's say today, we anticipate, we've got an indication from them that those sales will occur, you know, in 3 years, 2024. Technically, other assets that are now going to propose to interconnect to that same feeder could avail themselves of the first on a feeder rule between now and 2024 under that first on a feeder rule exception. But again, as I was mentioning, I think the rules are a little bit clearer and more cut and dry that if a subsequent generator, you know, wanted to engage in wholesale power sales following the Schedule 23 process, would absolutely afford them the opportunity to participate in wholesale transactions. If they try to avail themselves of the first on a feeder rule, you know, it could, in theory, potentially, you know, not be there for them when they actually want to participate in the market.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I think we got one more here. Mike, this one's for you. It says, if an inverter spec sheet says something like UL 1741/IEEE 1547, FCC Part 15 Class B, does that qualify as SB type? This particular spec sheet also says it's certified UL 1741-SA, California Rule 21. Does that mean it's both?
Yeah, so there are separate and distinct testing criteria. So there is still a UL 1741 criteria. Then there's also a SA testing criteria, and there is an SB that we talked about today. So the fact that if a spec sheet says, you know, says a reference to Class B or anything else, that does not mean that it is SB certified. You're going to need to look for some affirmation in that product documentation that says UL 1741-SA or -SB. So it's going to be clearly called out in the equipment spec sheet. So for the particular one in the question, if it says that it's certified to SA, it just means that it is SA certified, and that's all. You know, so in the future, like we talked about today, we're going to be looking for similar type of markings that say SB. So it's going to be very clear and distinct that it's an SA or SB listed product.
Great, thank you. All right, so we're at 11 now. I do have one more question here that's popped up several times, not just on this meeting, right, but ones that we've addressed here in the past. I'll address this one question, and then we'll finish up with some closing remarks, and we'll go from there. So this question says, if a feeder shows 0 available DG hosting capacity, can customers still install a behind the meter DG installation as long as its exporting is blocked by controls and protective relaying? So we've dealt with this question quite a bit, actually, over the course of the last several months. Right, I mean, some things I think go without saying. You'd still need to apply with that. It would most likely end up needing to be studied, and we would work through a solution to interconnect the project. Right, system modifications could be identified, and we work through our normal process overall. But I do think the question is focusing on if there's no export, right, what's the impact on available capacity? And what ends up happening, right, especially with existing load, is you're offsetting load, right? So that changes the math across the board on the feeder around the existing generation that's there today and future generation that could ultimately come online. The change in load forces us to have to study it to understand what the impacts are, right? And then that project who would be changing that load profile of that load customer, of that site, whatever it is, right, would be responsible for system modifications, even if it was a 0 export. Different conversation, can be had if it's new load. That's a conversation that we would bring up and discuss internally, right? And if other options presented themselves in a situation when it was a non-export, fully offsetting of new load or partial offsetting of new load, those are a little bit different and would require some more discussion with the CEI and the engineering team here at National Grid. So just wanted to address that one because it has popped up quite a bit recently over the last few months as we continue to deal with some of our saturation issues and other issues that have ultimately popped up. So with that, that is actually the end of, no other questions came in since I started that one. So we will push towards the end of the meeting. I do want to mention that we will be posting the recording and the slide deck itself in the next couple of days as part of the slide deck. Right, there is an appendix with some links that would be ultimately helpful as part of that. So definitely jump in there and try to utilize those. We will clean up our Q&A, and we will ultimately post that Q&A doc here in the coming weeks. Right, but obviously it's recorded, and if you want to go back and listen to those answers, feel free. But we will be posting a written Q&A doc here in the next couple of weeks. So I think with that, we appreciate everybody making time, and we will actually be getting back together here in a couple of weeks. Let me see if I have the exact date to our normal October schedule. I believe it is Thursday, October 14th. Where we'll talk a little bit more about the normal interconnection process across the three process tracks: simplified, expedited, and standard, in addition to a couple of additional topics that we'll be preparing and discussing for next month's meeting. But the form will continue to be open for the rest of the day today, right? So if you have any additional questions and you want to submit those questions through that form, we will address them as part of the Q&A doc when that gets finalized and posted. But with that, appreciate everybody's time, and I'm sure we'll all talk soon. Thank you.